Hello, everyone, and welcome. As you all get to take a seat, take time to bring everything you need for this amazing session that is ahead of us. Whatever is needed. We're going to wait a few more minutes so that everyone is nicely settled before the class starts. So we usually begin at 12:05 p.m. EST, which is where we are here. But of course, we are all over the world. In fact, Sinead is in London. We are so excited to have you, Sinead, be a part of this amazing class. Sinéad Burke is joining us from London today. As you are all getting ready for this class, I just would like to remind everyone to use the Q&A to put your questions later on. And of course, the Slow Factory tradition is to use the chat to tell us where you are signing in from. If you know the unceded territory that you are on, you can mention it here. I am on unceded territory of the Lenape-Hoking. If you need to know, you can go to our team, Slow Factory, will put the link here, but I think it's nativeland.ca. My name is Céline Seman. I am one of the co-founders of the Slow Factory. I have brown curly hair. We've never done this before, so this is my first time, and it's thanks to Sinead who encouraged me. So I have brown curly hair. I'm wearing a red top, and I am in a room full of light behind me. And I am so thrilled and excited to introduce Sinéad Burke, who is going to be giving us an amazing talk today about designing accessibility, but make it fashion. Sinead, if you want to join us just by lightly introducing yourself. We are still waiting for a few more people to trickle in. I will be back after for the Q&A. Thank you so much. Oh, one more thing. I would like to welcome April, our American Sign Language interpreter. Thank you so much, Nick, for organizing this. April and Cookie will be signing today. And thank you, Leah, Cynthia, and Nick for organizing and supporting us today. And a big thank you to the Slow Factory team, Nicole, Krista, Paloma, who are here today, and Ale, who is new and who is going to be helping us as well, just capturing the best moments of this amazing panel. Thank you so much. Sinead, this is your turn. Thank you so much for being here.
Celine, thank you so much. And thank you to the entire team at Slow Factory for the invitation to give this lecture today. To start, like Celine, I want to begin with a visual description of myself for accessibility reasons, which is fitting for today. I'm a white cisgendered woman who is visibly and physically disabled. I'm a little person. I have brown hair that is usually around my shoulder length, but it's a little bit longer than that at the moment. I'm wearing a black turtleneck, Steve Jobs like almost, and a black leather jacket sat in front of a backdrop that has blue curtains here in London. As Celine shared, there is a chat box and a Q&A that is available throughout this session. Celine began by thanking her team, and it's only fair that I do the same for mine. So I'm actually surrounded by my team, Michael and Emma, who are here and on hand to support with all of the interactions and questions that you may have. So please do be engaged. In our work, we start with the premise that we don't know what we don't know. And I hope by the end of this hour, we all come away knowing more, whether that's about the world, design, or ourselves. So please do get engaged. But this workshop is called Designing Accessibility, but Make It Fashion, mostly because of my lived experiences of being a disabled person who is thoroughly invested in and interested in the fashion system, but trying to find ways by in which to change it. But in order to create systemic change, it often requires more than one person. It needs frameworks, systems, policies, and practices, which is so much of the reason of Tilting the Lens and its existence. So to teach you something today, the deaf artist Christine Sun Kim created a sign name for our company. So Tilting the Lens is the 2L. So we'll get started. In terms of the session today, we're going to bring you through 5 different chapters. But the idea is that we're going to be dispelling the myth that design cannot be just functional, but it can also be beautiful when we have considerations, meaningful and intentional considerations to do with accessibility. And to start, Tilting the Lens is a consultancy that asks, is this accessible? And then we work with clients, civil society, and disabled people to come up with beautiful, creative solutions. We bring visibility to inaccessibility, and we design with disabled people, not for disabled people. We want to build an accessible, equitable world. And we believe that if we do that, we create agency, dignity, ease, and pride, not just for disabled people, but for everyone. That's our work. So before we get into the contents of today's lecture, I really just want you to look to the mantra that we have when doing the work. As I shared earlier, we don't know what we don't know. It's pretty important in the midst of this session that you take time to understand your own privilege and bias. We all have both of these in various degrees. Find comfort in the discomfort. I don't doubt that there will be something as part of the session today that you may not have thought about before. That's okay. Now, what are you going to do with that greater awareness? We believe that empathy, listening, advocacy, and vulnerability are the greatest tools to create change. We want to focus on lived experience. We want to focus on accessibility being top of your agenda. And I think most important at all for you to know that this lecture today is not the work. This is merely an introduction to go and give you a call to action to bring this as part of your daily agenda. So we're going to bring you through 5 sections: context and vocabulary, the business case, the innovation opportunity. We're going to share some takeaways and some additional resources so that you can go and learn more and move from awareness to action within this work. But I want to start here. One of the greatest challenges that we face to this work is 2 things: a lack of shared understanding around what disability is, and then a nervousness, concern, or fear of saying the wrong thing. And a lack of understanding of those 2 pillars often creates apathy, meaning we don't have conversations and action never comes about. So I think it's important that we acknowledge that disability can be visible and invisible. And by that, I mean disability can come in the shape of being physical, learning, sensory, mental health, mental illness, disease, or chronic illness. So for example, did you know that cancer qualifies as a disability in the same way that anxiety and depression does? Dyslexia, autism, cerebral palsy, eating disorders. There is so much within the lived experience of disability, but often our understanding of disability is limited to those representations that we find in media and culture, which is often one-dimensional and not true to the lived experience of people. I imagine if we were to ask the group of people participating in this session, are you disabled? There's a great likelihood that it is far more than me who is disabled on this call. Disability can also be inherited or acquired. It can be temporary or permanent. Disability is part of the life cycle of our world. Imagine one of you could leave here in this moment. You could go out from your front door, from your office space, wherever you might be. You could trip and fall, and momentarily you experience disability for however long it takes for your arm or your leg to mend. Or maybe you go skiing and have an accident. This isn't to make you feel fearful of disability, but for you to understand and realize that this is part of our life. Disability isn't something that exists external to us, but is part of the human life cycle and our day-to-day experience. But what is the definition of disability? The United Nations talks about disability as any condition that has a substantial and long-term effect on a person's ability to carry out day-to-day activities or make it difficult to interact with the world around them. This is a medical definition of disability that often qualifies you for benefits or access, or to gain the supports and accommodations that you need in order to have a more equitable experience in the world. But often it is definitions like this that make us feel reluctant to identify as disabled, not seeing it as something that makes us innovators by design or coming from a place of community or pride. I'm also not trying to undermine the fact that being disabled brings its challenges, whether that be pain, societal perceptions, or the infrastructure challenges that we experience day to day. But what if we were to come up with a new definition of disability? Or even better, become more comfortable with the use of the word disabled in and of itself. And I want us to think about that because it's really important to acknowledge that language shapes our society. We don't just name words, they have a cultural meaning and value to us. And I want us to think about this and how we describe disability. As regards to the models of disability, which go all the way from the medical model now to the rights and justice model, which looks at disability through a lens of intersectionality, we often come about these two different domains in how we describe disability. Person first language, which means I am a person with a disability. And then identity first language, I am a disabled person. In my visual description of myself, I identified myself using identity first language. But if you were to speak to me 5 years ago, I would have described myself as a person with a disability. I guess at the time I saw myself as a person first, and my disability didn't define me. What I didn't realize at that time was there was probably some internal ableism within how I thought about myself and how the world saw me. I don't doubt that there is still some internal ableism within me today, but I've reframed my perspective. My disability does define me in the same way that my identities of gender, my identities of nationality, where I live and how I live, all define me too. So I proudly describe myself as a person, as a disabled person. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that different communities and different parts of the disabled community describe themselves differently. We need to give people space to use the language that provides them with agency, but we also need to become comfortable with the term disability. In our work, one of the greatest challenges that we have had in thinking about how we shift our thinking around awareness to action as regards to disability and accessibility is the lack of language that exists around accessibility. If you were to think of something being accessible, my guess is you may think of, I don't know, a bathroom or something that's solely about function and that is about supporting and helping people, rather than a design innovation rooted in creativity. So at Tilting the Lens, we've come up with a working definition for accessibility, which is constantly changing and evolving, but it's what we strive to achieve in our work. So we believe that accessibility is a continuous and evolving practice. We think that accessibility is achieved through intentional, meaningful, and intersectional participation of people with lived experience of exclusion. We believe that accessibility must be key to each stage of a product, place, or policy development, from ideation through to delivery and merchandising. Solutions must be designed with disabled people to prioritize form and function. Meaningful and deliberate accessibility builds inclusion, equity, agency, creativity, innovation, and pride. But how do you define accessibility? What would you describe it as if you were coming up with a new definition to open the mindsets of designers, be they in product, architecture, artistry, fashion? What goal would you give them to rethink accessibility? Is it something from our working definition? Or is it much broader? I would genuinely love to know, and we'll come back to it in the Q&A session at the end. So please do begin telling us what your definitions of accessibility could and should be. Next, we're going to move to the business case. We went back and forward as a team in thinking about whether or not to place the business case as part of this lecture. We've had lots of conversations with Slow Factory about the rationale of including themes around capitalism within this space. And this isn't about subscribing to a culture of capitalism, but we also know that in terms of interdependence, in terms of individualism versus the collectivism that is required for systemic change in accessibility, if we don't look to business, and if we don't provide a rationale that is not just about human rights and dignity and the good and best thing to do, but also realizing that this is about key to business sustainability in the future, we hope that this brings about a more accelerated rate of change within this strategic action plan. So the business case. I guess we want to start with a statistic from the United Nations. Did you know that 1 billion people live with some form of disability? making up around 15% of the global population. And whilst this statistic feels like many, I think it's important to acknowledge that the CDC in the US, for example, have just defined long COVID as a disability. If we think about the stigma that is attached to disability within our society, and how many of us, particularly if we are invisibly disabled, feel reluctant to identify as disabled because it makes us feel less. We worry about our employer, our family, or our friends. If we created a culture and a society where people were imbued with pride to identify as disabled, how many more than 1 billion people would it be? How much more would it be than 15% of the global population? My guess, it's more of us than you think. And as we move to thinking about the financial aspects of this work, the disabled population has a disposable income of 1.9 trillion US dollars per year. This is research undertaken by the Return on Disability Group. And I think it's important to acknowledge that when we include family and friends in the circle of influence that the disabled community have, this figure rises to 6.9 trillion US dollars. But as we think about and consider the business case, it's important to also acknowledge that in most developing countries, the unemployment rate of disabled people is between 50 and 75%. We need to amend that figure. And by doing so, by creating greater employment and access to education, we too will increase the spending power, but also the creative and innovation opportunities too. But for organizations, and maybe you participating in this workshop, maybe you're a designer, how do you think about access to funding? How do you think about scaling? How do you think about the ways in which you can prioritize this work when you already feel so incredibly busy? You have so many tasks to do. Well, there is $10 billion in design spending going to be set aside for companies that prioritize accessibility within this decade. And that's according to Forbes. So in terms of this being a business incentive for you to think about accessibility across digital, product, design, HR, recruitment, legal, there are so many ways in which you can build this into your practice. And what we're seeing is there is a growing need from the consumer market, but also the corporate industry for you to undertake this work. We also want to look to the innovation opportunity. So in thinking about the innovation opportunity, I guess what we wanted to speak to here was to really communicate the ways in which we need to rethink accessibility. Just think for a second there about the working definition that we shared with you. This is about bringing agency, dignity, ease, community, and pride. But most importantly, it's also about creativity. We're going to show some case studies and some examples very soon about how we need to rethink accessibility. But the innovation opportunity here begins with disabled people. At Tilting the Lens, we like to talk about disabled people as being innovators by design. Unfortunately, that's a burden that they have had to inherit due to living in a world that is not designed for them. And having to do that has meant that they've had to hack their systems, engineer the physical world, and code switch in between places in order for it to be more accessible for them. Disabled people are innovators and come to these challenges with creative solutions. But what about if you're not disabled? You're a designer and you want to create a praxis and a framework within this space. I guess the first place to look to is the principles of universal design and also partnering with disabled people. So if you don't know, the principles of universal design create a module by which we can use this as a process to think about our design steps. So it asks us to create equitable use, flexibility in use, simple and intuitive use, perceptible information, tolerance for error, low physical effort, size and space for approach and use. So thinking about equitable use, maybe that's with the scissors. How can everybody experience the design or use of the scissors in an equitable way? I mean, I guess that's why we have left-handed scissors. But what does that look like if you have limited or low dexterity? In the same way, if we think about simple and intuitive use, if you're designing a product that has instructions, how are those instructions being considerate of the different audiences that might exist? Are they available in plain language, in multiple languages? Is there an audio version along with images? We need to move away from assuming that our customer, along with our employee or our user, is one-dimensional, or the one type of caricature that we have been designing for forever. What that resulted in was creating a world that only accommodated a few. Let's broaden our horizons as we consider design for a new process and take these principles and make them real. But what does it mean when we think about taking the principles of universal design and working within the space of design, where we have expectations that it must be beautiful and functional? We believe that this is entirely possible. And we actually set the goal for ourselves that in our design processes, innovative and accessible design must be functional and beautiful at the same time. Because for too long, disabled people have been given products and services that, whilst they are designed with them in mind, their dignity and pride are rarely considered. Let's have a look at some examples. On screen, we have 3 images. I'm going to do my utmost to explain them in detail. On the left-hand side is the first image, and to share that this section is about providing case studies and how we consider universal design in practice, specifically around architecture. So the first image is of concrete outdoor steps. There's 3 of them. On the steps is a silver fold-out ramp. It's quite clunky, though it does look lightweight. At the top of the stairs, we see a cutoff of a wheelchair user. They're wearing brown leather shoes and grey pants. The ramp is there so that the wheelchair user can transfer down the stairs with ease. But it makes us ask questions about, why do the stairs exist at all? Why is the ramp temporary? And why does the ramp look like this? It doesn't at all blend in with the beautiful, historic, quite antiquated setting. It's very modern, but it feels clinical rather than beautiful. And I guess the answer is that the ramp was designed this way. And my belief is that whoever was designing that ramp probably wasn't in need to use it, nor anybody they know. The second image is an alternative. This is the Guggenheim Museum in New York. If you have been to the Guggenheim Museum, you might know that it is built on a ramp from the ground floor up. It is this beautiful spiral that lifts from the ground floor all the way to the ceiling in the most gorgeous cascading of light. Whether you are a wheelchair user, a person with a mobility aid, somebody who is bringing their suitcase having just traveled from the airport, a parent with a stroller, you will have an equitable experience at the Guggenheim Museum. You will be able to see the portraits, the displays, and the writing, should you be sighted, in a way that feels much more accessible and accommodating for you. When the architect was putting the Guggenheim together, it was never intended to be a bastion of accessibility. But when we look from image 1 to image 2, our definition of the ramp is entirely challenged, because this is an example that maybe it wasn't defined and still isn't as a ramp, but what it is a symbol of accessibility. The third image is one from a fashion show. It's from a Gucci fashion show where models are traveling down a travelator, like one you may see in the airport. They are beautifully dressed in black glasses with beautiful seashell decorated pajama-esque, but I think they're day clothes, and red leather gloves, of course. But again, when we think about a ramp, we rarely ever think about a runway. A runway is a ramp for models and everyone. And yet it makes us ask a question where Fashion Week happens at least 2 seasons per year, post and pre-pandemic, though are we post-pandemic? And yet the visibility of physically disabled models who need access to a ramp is still something that is contested. If we look at the fashion weeks of the most recent season in Fashion Month, physically disabled models were limited to 1, 2, maybe 3 catwalks. And yet it's a ramp. We consider this a beautiful architectural process that communicates our messages and icon about our clothes to the world. And yet it's designed primarily for disabled people, but still continues to exclude them. The next section is also about a contrast in how we think about universal design in practice through interior design. In the left-hand image is what is described as the Americans with Disabilities Act accessible bathroom. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is often known as the ADA for short, is as old as me. It is 31 years old, and it was legislation that was created and kind of mandated by disabled people in the US in order to bring about a minimum standard for accessibility and rights for disabled people. It's intriguing to know that some of the most advanced legislation that exists in the world is only 31 years old. The legislation was intended to be a starting point rather than a full stop. But the appetite to be compliant has meant that we never move from compliance to creativity. These two examples are an excellent case study of that. On the left is, as I said, an ADA compliant bathroom. There is a toilet that is higher, so a wheelchair user can transfer with ease. There is grab bars that have a color contrast to the tiles on the wall. There is a soap dispenser, a hand dryer, paper towels, and there is a red security alarm. But there's no mirror, because a mirror isn't defined within that building standard for an ADA bathroom. Because my guess is whenever architects are putting this together, and designers too, they never consider that disabled people might want to see themselves, look at themselves, check if they have lipstick on their teeth. But also, if you can imagine yourself being in the space, it feels cold, clinical. The tiles are gray, not a chic, minimalist, millennial gray. A clinical, othering gray. You want to enter the space and leave it immediately. But on the right-hand side is a personal accessible bathroom that has beautiful textures from wooden floors to wooden walls and contrasting white tiles. There's beautiful kind of ochre colored yellow towels. There is an accessible toilet, but there's a real design consideration to this space. It is thinking about the user as an individual, as a person, and making sure that the accommodations are aesthetically comparable. How do we create spaces that are like this, not just in a personal capacity, but in a public realm? Because this design process speaks to who gets to belong and who gets to participate. The next example is universal design in practice and thinking about technology. So there are three symbols which we may all be familiar with. On the left is an example of iMessage, the text messaging solution from Apple. Did you know that in 1992, text messaging was created for the deaf community? And it was created because phone calls were inaccessible. Now, we send 2 billion SMS messages per day. That is outside of our Instagram DMs, TikTok, WhatsApp, or whatever platform you might use to communicate. This is purely SMS messages, 2 billion of them a day. It proves that when you design for one in thinking about the deaf community as one unit and extend that process to many, there is a value proposition that we haven't yet imagined. So too, one of creativity and innovation. The second icon on the slide is a black box with, in white lettering, CC, standing for closed captions. There is an automatic transcription within this lecture and session. And when finished the recording and when it goes online, there will be live captions. Closed captioning is, of course, useful and brilliant and needed for the deaf community. But it is also useful in lots of other ways. For those who do not speak English as a first language, or if you're not able to fully pay attention, or if, like me, you're in a shared workspace at the moment and you can't have the audio available loudly, you can turn on the closed captions. But what we also know from even human behavior is that if you begin to caption your social media content, even such as your Instagram stories or your TikTok videos, you will engage a broader audience, because how many of us are not sitting here day to day with our AirPods? Again, something that was supposed to be an accessibility accommodation through the lens of universal design has value for everyone. And on the third box is the icon for Siri. How many of us are more familiar with Siri now, or Alexa, or Google Home? Again, these innovations were thinking about access accommodations for those who are blind or low vision, By sharing, hey, Alexa, or hey, Google Home, or hey, Siri, all of a sudden I can put an alarm on, I can put phone calls, I can do all sorts, turn lights on. And whilst it does give us, maybe raise questions around security, it provides agency for so many. How do we rethink our perceptions around design in whatever industry you're part of to really be looking through the perspective of universal design? And one of the growing markets that's beginning to think about this work is universal design and beauty. On the left-hand side, we have a bottle of cream, which looks like it's in a blue tub. And what we see on the icon is that the foil lid is kind of roughly half on and half off, and some very luxurious cream is inside. I really struggle with products like this. I have small hands. My fine motor skills are sometimes challenging. I find it difficult to often open a bottle of soda or a bottle of water. And when it comes to the beauty products that I love and spend too much time on, I find it a challenge because often what is a security help for children creates inaccessibility for me. And sometimes we just don't rethink our design solutions that once worked, that no longer cater to the audience that we imagine. But on the right-hand side is a new product from Glossier, actually. This is a perfume. The image is of a person outstretching their hand, I think at a waterfall. I'm not sure who's putting perfume on at a waterfall, but hey, it works. And what they have is a device that looks egg-shaped. It's pink, and the device in half kind of swatches across. So one half slides to the left, the other slides to the right. And what's inside is kind of a pod of almost a wax-like substance. And when you rub your finger or your hand or whatever device you might need into it, you're able to put the perfume onto your skin. But what's beautiful and wonderful about this is, my understanding is it was not necessarily designed for the disabled market, but creating a product and a product packaging of this nature makes it more accessible for everyone. It makes it easier to throw it in your bag or to use it at a moment's notice. So again, how are we thinking about this design process in our day-to-day, and how do we become more observing to it? Because maybe you've never looked at a cream and thought, this doesn't work. Maybe you've never saw a lipstick and kind of asked the question, how does somebody who only uses one hand open this? We need to become more familiar with these questions, engage our day-to-day curiosity, expand our learning and our knowledge. And then for those of us in positions of privilege to be able to design differently, begin to act on it right away. And lastly, wanted to speak specifically around kind of universal design and practice around fashion. I'm very privileged that at Tilting the Lens, we have some incredible fashion clients across the spectrum, from the luxury fashion system to more affordable fashion. We're not just working in product, though it is a key part of our work. We're making sure that the fashion system understands that the solution to these challenges must be holistic. We must be hiring disabled people in order to have better adaptive designers. But to give you some examples of where universal design in practice needs to come about, on the image of the left is a woman, or a person who identifies as a woman, drawing up the zip at the back of the dress. This is my favorite example of how we know that fashion isn't really considering of all of us who use and wear clothes. Because I imagine I am not the only person on this call who at one stage has had to sleep in a dress in my life. And it is because the zip is so high and at the back, and I don't have enough extension of reach from beyond my neck down my back, that I end up contorting myself. It's too much hassle. There's an amazing photo of the actress Jane Fonda after an incredible award ceremony where she wakes up the next day with makeup down her face, still in her couture dress. Because dresses were designed in an era where women and those who wear them had husbands or domestic help. We no longer live in that environment, nor are we guaranteed to. So why is our design process not being more accommodating, but also considerate and informed of who the customer actually is? In the image here, a person is using an adaptive device, which is a piece of string attached to a silver metal buckle that is attached to the zip, which allows them to open and close it independently. It's brilliant. But at Tilting the Lens, what we try to do is not just find the hacks to join the dots, but transform the system. An example of this work that is happening and how we think about universal design in practice is this video that I'm going to show first and then visually communicate afterwards. So what happened in that 14-second silent video was a video of a model putting their feet into what Nike called their fly ease shoe. This shoe was demanded and requested after people communicated and said, it's too difficult to place my feet in shoes, lace them up with independence. I can't do that. Nike created this hinge effect within the sole by which an individual places their foot into the shoe and automatically it closes over the foot and gives them such comfort and confidence independently without ever having to touch laces or ever having to use their hands. This was really celebrated for its design process. But one of the great challenges that we have in all of this work is ensuring the principles of designing with disabled people, but also nothing about us without us. How do we ensure that while we were talking about earlier, we're creating greater accessibility and inclusion for disabled people in the world, but also making sure that we are continue to market them, communicate to, with, and about them in products, but also making sure that we're acknowledging that 50 to 75% of disabled people are unemployed and that the cost of these products need to be considerate of that market. Though, my question is, if Nike can create a fly ease shoe, what can you create? What can you design? What can you even imagine? If you're sitting here and thinking, I don't have the resources to create a hinge-based trainer or sneaker, great. But what can you design and imagine? And how we think about it at Tilting the Lens, there's a lot of work happening within the adaptive space, specifically within fashion. But one of our considerations is ensuring that we are not othering by design. This is very much from our learning of different communities. If you think to the community that describes themselves as fat or plus size, for such a long time and continuing to this day, they have been speaking to the fashion system and saying, we need better offerings. Due to the fat phobia and to the lack of awareness and the lack of representation within the system, what was created was a capsule collection by which there was a limited offering in very limited hues and still in limited sizing. It was placed in the corner of a back of a store with a big sign that says plus size over here. Think of the experience of that individual coming into that store, having to go to their small section and to then pick out one or two items that they may not even like, but it's all that's available. We must learn from that process and be holistic and again, intersectional in our thinking. So we want to create adaptive fashion that is not just adaptive for and with and by disabled people, but that really thinks through a process that is about including everyone. Because here's the thing, adaptive fashion is what everyone needs and is what will give greater agency to all users and wearers. So our process is thinking about form and fixture. So magnetic buttons, Velcro, fabric, if it can stretch, if it's for sensitivities for those who are autistic or with skin conditions. What are the customization offerings and how can technology support this? What is the offering within packaging? How do we create and build more accessible retail? And then how can we look at assistive technologies and digital tools to be able to fill the gap? Is the metaverse going to be more accessible? I don't know. We're working on that. So in thinking about these processes, what we tried to show you today was bringing you through 4 or 5 different industries to provide a scope, to challenge your perceptions, and to give you a blueprint to reimagine what might be possible through design. But as we shared at the very beginning, this is not the work. The work starts the minute this call ends and you begin to put this into practice. But we have 3 key principles that we want you to embed in your thinking and in your work. The first is design for one, extend to many. Keep disabled people in the disabled community as your kind of core customer, but expand your horizons about how that learning and innovation and opportunity and process can be of value to wider society. You must design with disabled people, not for disabled people. They must be key to this work and they must be economically valued and they must be creating space for power and agency so that they too are decision makers within this process, not just consultants, but designers. I say that as a consultant. And our attempts at inclusion should not be othering by design. Please feel free to take a screenshot of that or whatever is accessible to you. We ask you to live these considerations. And in terms of takeaways, we want you to acknowledge that disability is not a bad word. We want you to say the word disabled and avoid euphemisms. Please do not talk about special needs or differently abled or handicapped. So many of these words are talking about ability, not disability. So many of these words and terminologies and phrases were created to give it distance to disability because we thought it was a bad thing. Trust me when I tell you that it is not. Let's imbue the word disabled with pride and community and be confident in your use of it. But again, creating space for those disabled people who may prefer to describe themselves differently. We ask you from today onwards to make your social media content more accessible, because your impact and blueprint, whether you have 100 followers or 1 million, will create seismic change in how we communicate to one another and how we expect people to communicate with us. So caption your videos, include alt text and or visual descriptions for images and videos. Write hashtags in camel case, which means every new word has a capital letter. Hashtag Slow Factory, capital S, capital F. Use emojis and GIFs infrequently. So use them if possible, and include visual descriptions. And that's because screen readers, which is what people who are blind or low vision or those with ADHD for various reasons may use to engage with the internet. Screen readers cannot read or understand emojis or GIFs. Be cognizant of color contrast and flashing lights, and add voiceovers on text-led content. We also want you to acknowledge that we don't know what we don't know. And I give you a question to go and ask at school, at home, in the cinema, on a Zoom call, or at work. Ask, is this accessible? Open up people's perspectives and the area of influence that you have access to. Help us to move from awareness to action through conversations and curiosity. We can only do this if we're all doing this together. We need to make places, spaces, and products more accessible. And before we leave and go to the Q&A, I hope you have questions, we want to share with you some additional resources. So now's the time to get your screenshots ready, to get your cameras up, but also know that we'll be sharing this afterwards too. So if this feels too stressful for you to record right now, please don't worry. Here's some recommended reading. This is from our Tilting the Lens library, and these are books that we have read, audiobooks that we have listened to and really recommend. Mismatch, How Inclusion Shapes Design by Kat Holmes. Disability Visibility by Alice Wong. Accessible America by Bess Williamson. What Can a Body Do by Sarah Hendren. Alt Text as Poetry by Shannon Finnegan. A Kind of Spark by Ellie Nicole. Neurotribes, The Legacy of Autism and How to Think Smarter About People Who Think Differently by Steve Silberman. Haben, The Deaf-Blind Woman Who Conquered Harvard Law by Haben Verma. And Demystifying Disability, What to Know, What to Say, and How to Be an Ally by Emily Lado. And lastly, we invite you to support disabled artists and activists. So much of this is about doing the work, creating awareness for ourselves and learning more. These are Christine Sunkin, Rosie Jones, Shalaman, Ava Wall, Dr. Rosaline McDonough, Melissa Thompson, Ryan O'Connell, Shannon Finnegan, Mia Mingus, Isabel Mavreed Calderon, Andrea Levant, Sins Invalid. But here's the question for you. Who are the other disabled artists and activists that we should include in our work going forward? Who do we not know about? Maybe it's you. If it is you, make sure to tell us. Tag or DM us at Tilting the Lens on Instagram. I want to thank you. We have already been together for almost 50 minutes. And I guess how I want to kick off the Q&A before Celine comes back is by asking you two questions. What made you think differently in this workshop today? And what is the action that you are taking away and going to begin to undertake from tomorrow onwards? What is it going to be? Thank you so much. I'm Sinead. You can get in touch with me at the Sinead Burke on Instagram and with the wider team at Tilting the Lens. We have some great resources there that can really support your work. So do find us, tell us what we're missing, and tell us what we can continue to build. Gurv Mila Magriv, thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite Celine back.
Thank you so much, Sinead. This was amazing. So couldn't screenshot fast enough. And I also
Oh,
realized, oh, are you there? Yes.
yes, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes. And I also realized that, this was my first time visually describing myself. So thank you so much. And I also realized I didn't talk about my gender. And I didn't also talk about my ethnic background, because I just was like, I have curly hair and I'm wearing a red shirt. And so maybe that's describing almost an emoji. So I would like to add that I'm Lebanese and I'm from Middle Eastern heritage, and that I am a woman and I identify as she, they. And thank you so much, Sinead, for just kicking off this talk by saying we don't know what we don't know, because there is a lot of fear, as you mentioned in the beginning of your talk, about, oh my gosh, I don't want to say anything that's wrong. And with that, I would like to encourage our public, our audience, the amazing folks that are listening and watching and learning, and just in reading the chat. It's been very well received, and a lot of things have sparked inside us. And to be able to ask questions without fearing that you're doing something wrong. Like, for example, I just said listening and learning, and it's super ableist. And I recognize my internalized ableism as well. And as I am learning and unlearning in this space, and also understanding that what is considered disability is something that we are also learning together. For instance, Sinead, you mentioned that the long COVID has been considered a disability. And with that, there's also the understanding, and I was chatting yesterday with Jess Chung, a friend of mine, who was just teaching me, I guess, but without wanting to teach me, but I was also learning. So I guess I was openly learning with her teaching me, I guess. I'm so sorry, about neurodivergence and how it is being diagnosed, and for it to be diagnosed, what you have to go through. And often there is a big movement right now in self-diagnosis of autism and of other neurodivergent things, I guess. That and as I was reading what she was going through, I was like, oh my gosh, I think I'm on the spectrum. I'm identifying as this and identifying as that. But I said I don't want to over identify, and she's like, no, you gotta identify. This is
Yeah.
up to you to identify.
And just to speak to that, there is a question in the chat box from Emma Baumgart. And Emma says, I've seen a lot of people talking about being neurodivergent lately on social media, especially TikTok. Is this part of the disability community, or is this one of the euphemisms like you mentioned? No, Emma, it is absolutely part of the disability community. Neurodivergence is an amazing aspect of the disability community. And depending on where you sit, so neurodivergence may be ADHD, it may be autism, and some of the books that we recommended, like Steve Silverman's book, really goes into this in exceptional detail. And I think the more that we can acknowledge and realize that we all exist in the world in different ways, in our bodies, in our minds, how we are perceived, how we perceive ourselves. And that reality goes back to the lived experience and the life cycle that we were talking to earlier. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there are much more of us who are disabled or neurodiverse than we might ever imagine. And the first step is being able to have these conversations, to open up and to illuminate the biases and the ableism that we hold in order to interrogate it and then hopefully identify.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sinead, for that, because the self-diagnosis is also something that's being much more talked about in the movement, that is more accessible than I'm just reading here. For instance, Julia Reck is saying getting an ADHD diagnosis, which was fairly recent for me, was such an ordeal. I appreciate this conversation acknowledgement. So yes, in fact, and what my friend, our peer Jess Chung was saying is that there is a huge movement that is happening in reclaiming the diagnosis itself.
Yes.
Do you have?
It does. Absolutely. And I think, I'm visibly disabled. So some of the advantages and then challenges that I have is that I can't code switch in environments as regards to hiding my disability. Perhaps the only place in which I can do that is, strangely enough, on Zoom, though you may know from my nose and my hands. But I think being able to self-diagnose, but again, it's about acknowledging the systems. we shouldn't be expecting people in order to self-diagnose. But if self-diagnosis is the only way, how do you then access the supports and the benefits, whether that's healthcare, whether that's psychology, or whatever it is that you might need in terms of support? So we need to acknowledge where the resources are being undertaken. And this then comes back to politics and who are we voting for, and how do political systems know that these things need greater resources. And I think we need greater advocacy as a collective in order to ensure that we are not becoming more ill or becoming more distanced from what an equitable existence might look like due to the lack of resources. If you don't mind, Celine, I just want to kind of speak to something that Felicia wrote in the chat box. Felicia, they say, I'm thinking more deeply about asking for what's most accessible for folks. I often just try to do my best, but it's better to ask what folks need so I can do my best to meet their specific needs. When folks ask me how to accommodate my disabilities, I feel very loved. So of course, my disabled friends would love and appreciate that act of love too. And they said, for my action, I'm going to describe emojis when I use them. I think that's wonderful. And to share a kind of alternate example, Felicia, a friend of mine, maybe I shouldn't be describing them as a friend, says to me all the time, I don't see you as a little person. They are not blind. They are sighted. And what they mean by that is they're trying to say to me, they see me as more than an old person. And often then again, I can't access anywhere that there is in their home. But speaking specifically to what Felicia said, I think there's two things here. Yes, ask people what it is that they need. But I think that if you are organizing an event, also be declarative about what you are already providing. So let's, for example, even think about this event. Let's be really clear that we are providing deaf interpreters in ASL and that we have automatic live transcriptions. And then ask, what else is it that you need? Because it can feel very alienating and othering and intimidating to have to email and say, hello, Slow Factory, my name is Sinead. If this event is taking place in person, could you let me know how accessible the school is and if it's possible to have a footstool? That takes great bravery and courage, even when the question is asked. So how instead do we communicate what's possible, what's available, so that people feel, this is a safe space. This is a culture that is already cognizant of accommodations and disabled people's access needs. I'm going to add to the list rather than being fearful that I'm the first, and this is a cost rather than an investment.
Thank you so much for this. This is amazing. I am so grateful for you. Honestly, it's a topic of conversation that is, oftentimes reserved for a specific, talk, and we wanted to bring it to the awareness. And of course, I hope this is not the last party, I shall say, the last event together, because we have just touched to a very broad level. So you described design and in various industries. You looked at, of course, fashion, because that's where you work, but you also looked at interior design, architecture, and even it goes beyond just design, but designing our movements, designing the way that our movements are accessible or not. For instance, most of the time we look at activism as marching on the streets or going out into a protest, for example. And even the language we use, we're like, we stand in solidarity. We are instead of saying, for instance, we stand with, yes. And instead of saying,
we are in solidarity.
Yes, exactly. So even as we design our movements, for example, within the Slow Factory ourselves, we oftentimes are grateful for the community that's like, hey, we don't say stand with, for instance, we say I am in solidarity. And this is something we've learned from our community.
And I just want to share, because there's a question about that as regards to language in the Q&A from Shayna or Shaya. I'm incredibly grateful for this insightful conversation. I believe that fragrances are part of the fashion world, but please do correct me if I'm wrong. As someone who is getting into fragrances, blind buying, so all of this language that we have in which there is ableism within it, how often do we talk about blind spots or deaf ears? It is entrenched within our vocabulary and within our language. And Shaina asks, any shorthand suggestions or alternatives for harmful language like this? So is it about hidden buying, invisible buying? What are the synonyms around this that we can think to that isn't about lessening the experience of disabled people and ridding ourselves within the ableism of our language? So some of the new words that I've adapted is about, I think everything is wild or bananas. because I'm refusing to use language like crazy or insane or stupid or dumb or lame, all of which is entrenched in our language and is due to the historical models of disability. So we need to change our language day to day and catch ourselves and maybe call ourselves out and in as to how we think about those things and find what the synonyms are.
It's such a good thing, because my daughter yesterday was telling me it was insane. And I was like, let's talk about that word together, you know? And so we were trying to find other words instead of insane, because of course she's young, like she's 10 years old. She doesn't understand what's behind that word and what we use it for in society. So we approached it in that sense. And even the word wild, I have a problem with, because it was oftentimes a word that was describing our people of the global majority, indigenous people. And so every time, even I was referred to as a wild woman many times in my life, where I felt it was degrading, it wasn't honoring wilderness. And now wild is coming back as like we're the wildening of certain areas, you know, it's to revive with native seeds and so on. And even that term is being contested, because a lot of indigenous communities are like, well, wait a second, now it's okay to say it, and so on and so forth. So language always
how
changes.
important that we're having this conversation, because you know, say what is relevant or what is considered to be inclusive from a disability perspective may not be from an Indigenous perspective. And we need to be having these conversations through an intersectional lens in order to come up with a shared vocabulary and a shared understanding that makes everybody feel safe. So I really appreciate you sharing that, Celine, and I'm going to change our language. That's my takeaway from today.
I was discussing, I honestly don't know why
I'm
saying it, because it's so funny that it's so synchronous. Like yesterday, I was talking to my daughter, who was literally describing a scene because their teachers is not there. And so of course, all the kids are going crazy. Crazy is a word that also I'm trying to remove from my vocabulary. She was like, so how do I say it? How do I express that we were going crazy? And is crazy bad? Like, I think crazy is good, and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of conversation, and I think it's a conversation, as you said, Sinead, like we personally, I don't know the right term, and also abiding by all of this right and wrong terms is also sort of limiting us into discovering and discussing openly what is.
But it's also about acknowledging that this evolves, and even from a disability perspective, what is accurate or fair as considered by the community today may be different tomorrow or next year. And that's just part of humanity too. We are allowed to change. We are allowed to change our minds. We are allowed to change our opinions. We have to evolve and grow. We can be wrong and then right. So I think those kinds of things are fair too. But I'm conscious of everybody's time. And I just want to share that if you have additional questions that we didn't get to today, as Celine said, I don't doubt that this will be an ongoing conversation at Slow Factory. But please, as we shared, you know, we are available on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter. If you are not on social media, our email is office@tiltingthelens.com. So please do feel free to get in touch, because we want to be accommodating too, that social media is not accessible or available to everyone either.
That's for sure. And oftentimes we go till 1:15, so we always have a 15 extra minute, but I am conscious of your time, Sinead. And if is not possible, we have two more questions. Maybe we can to them. One is from Nicole Groenke. What do you recommend for marketers to keep in mind when creating designs or copy to make it more accessible?
This is great, Nicole, and thank you so much for your question. And really, the answer is quite broad. So, and much of what has been discussed in the chat box is in line with what it is that we think at Tilting the Lens. Accessibility has to be by design. It has to be from the very, very beginning, rather than something that we think about at the end, be it a website or a campaign, because all of a sudden the solution that's able to be created in that moment is so limited, or actually incredibly impossible. So the questions that you need to be asking at the beginning of a marketing process, for example, so thinking about your copy, is it plain language? Is it free of ableism? And thinking about the graphics that you're putting together, does the color contrast match the WCAG standard, which is the digital accessibility standard? So is it AA or is it AAA? And there are some brilliant tools like on WebAIM that give you the opportunity to measure the color contrast. So white on black, black on white, very good. Yellow on blue, blue on yellow, very good. Pink on red, not so good. And this is for both dyslexia and those who are low vision. Then thinking about also, the representation within campaigns and marketing. Is there intersectional representation if you're featuring people? It's a challenge if you're featuring stock imagery because there isn't enough disabled representation in stock imagery, both visible and invisible, but also in the consideration around your marketing and your copy. How can you be considerate of all of those perspectives? And I guess the best example and sample to do that is about bringing groups of people together to user test your work in advance of it going live. Because unless we have representation around the table and we are open to hearing critical perspectives of our work, it will always be broadcast and aired with the prejudice that we don't know that we hold or are not aware of. So again, it's about kind of being inclusive by design and accessibility by design, but it's also in thinking about, if you're building a marketing campaign and it's a billboard, how is that also being perceived in other ways? Is there also an audio campaign that if you scan a QR code, you're led to a podcast where it's made audible? Is there something that has a transcript? Is it also available in Braille? It's about thinking through a multimodal perspective in order to have a really creative outcome and process that is accessible by design. I hope that answers that question. And then there's one more question which an anonymous attendee has shared. And they said, what is the importance of slowing down in the design process? Can you give an example of how moving fast could hurt, how slowing down could help? I can give you an example. So slowing down is important because for many of us, this work may be new. This awareness may be new. And we are working within a very difficult environment where we are still in a pandemic, where access to healthcare, depending on where you are in the world, is limited, where COVID continues to impact the most multiply marginalized communities. And yet we are expected to exist at a workflow that was pre-pandemic. So I want to be cognizant of the environmental pace that exists here. But simultaneously, the slowing down is necessary because if this is new to us, it requires us to live it, to feel it in our membrane almost, in order to really get much more accelerated at it. What I'll share is even among my team, we have all of these gap points and stop points in which we try to check ourselves to ensure that we're doing that process. We've had an experience where we have been working with an organization around social media. We did brilliant work with them. It was an amazing workshop. We thought it embedded, it was part of the workflow. And then all of a sudden, a post just had to go live. It had to happen immediately. And it went out without captions because there just wasn't enough time for somebody to review a process and go, what is every single step that we need to do here? Somebody in very senior management says it needs to go out at 2:00 and it has to go. So how do we think about this in a meaningful way? And then I guess from an organizational perspective, a lot of what we're doing for clients is how do we codify that? Because it is our job to provide a support service within that place. Because whilst, yes, you need to slow down to do this work, you also need the tools and the resources and the research to help you do that. Otherwise, it just becomes too much work outside of your day job, for example, to be able to really do it.
Thank you so much for that. That is so great. Thank you everyone for sharing links in the chat. We are going to compile all of this and the resources that you've shared. And if there are any other resources, Sinead, that you would like to share with us, please do so. We will be making sure to share with every participant as well as on our Slack. And if you would like to join our Slack, our team here is going to put the information in our chat. Every week we do the same. So you're all welcome to join us. All of our resources are so well organized in chat, thanks to Nick, Paloma, Nicole, who put all this together and organized the design of it in such a wonderful way. Aja Barber just came in an hour late. Yes, I'm
with
so
the best reels on Instagram.
Yes, with the best reels on Instagram. It's daylight savings. I'm so sorry. We should have mentioned that, but don't worry, Aja. We have recorded the session and we will be putting it live very, very soon. And until then, please join our, yes, you'll catch the replay. Please join our Slack if you haven't done so already. All of our resources are there. And Sinead, if you have, again, just repeating myself, any type of resources beyond the ones that you've shared here with the books and the podcasts and the accounts to follow, but if you have, for instance, additional podcasts or, for instance, articles or things that the Tilting the Lens has created, like reports that you could share that are available or anything whatsoever, And I would like to encourage everyone that if you have liked this class and all the other classes, if you can support us by donating, a small amount goes a long way. Slow Factory runs this program from the generous donations of our public, and we are so grateful for you all. This allows us to have a program that has no strings attached to any brands or their personal agenda or their company agenda. So it allows us to build a program that is open and free for sure, but also that does not have any constraints when it comes to the topic, the content, and allows us to have these open conversations without putting anyone agenda at risk. So Nicole here has put together a link for the Slack. And again, if you have any questions, but I think we can potentially close.
Yes. And just one last thing to say, thank you to April and Cookie and all of the ASL supports in the back end. It was such a treat working with you, and having deaf interpreters on screen is so important. So thank you, Slow Factory and Nick, for doing that too. And thank you to Michael and Emma on my end. Michael has been busy in the chat box, as you'll see, but we'll all be speaking again soon. Thank you so much, Celine.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Michael, for organizing the Q&A. I've never had such a easy Q&A ever. Maybe we need someone like Michael always. And thank you so much, April, Cookie. Thank you, Cynthia. And thank you as well, Nick, for organizing this, and Leah, who is here and who we've worked with so much. Thank you all so much. And the team at the Slow Factory, thanks you all. Have a beautiful weekend. Thank you. Thank you,
Bye,
Sinead.
everybody.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Bye.